Chapter 1. In the infinite darkness between the stars, where the warp's poisonous winds whispered, lies through the thin hulls of ships, the Emperor's fury sailed forward like a silver arrow through the night. The ship was a Lunar-class cruiser, one of the proud backbones of the Imperium's fleet, built in the sacred shipyards above Mars more than 300 years ago. Its hull, covered in layers of adamantium and engravings that honored the Emperor's eternal vigil, stretched 5 kilometers from the pointed prow to the broad stern, where enormous plasma reactors rumbled like the heart of a slumbering giant. Thousands of souls lived and died within its walls, ordinary humans, pressed together in cramped corridors filled with the scent of oil, sweat, and incense, from the daily prayers to the Omnissiah and the Emperor. Captain Elias Vaughn stood on the command bridge, a raised platform of polished steel and flickering rune screens that monitored the ship's inner and outer worlds. He was a man in his 40s, with a face carved from granite, scarred by battles against orcs and Eldar that few others had survived. His uniform, black with gold trim, fit like armor on his broad shoulders, and around his neck he wore an amulet bearing the Emperor's aquila, a reminder of the faith that had kept him alive through 13 campaigns. Beside him stood Navigator Lyra Voss, a pale figure in a hooded robe adorned with star constellations, her eyes concealed behind a mesh of silver wires that shielded her mind from the warp's horrors. She stared out into the void through the great observatory window, where the stars twinkled like distant fire eyes. "Captain," she said, her voice echoing with distant dreams, "the warp currents are restless. We're approaching a rift, a tear in the fabric. It feels as if something is awakening." Vaughn nodded curtly, his gaze fixed on the holographic chart hovering before him. They were en route from Sector Epsilon Draconis, following a victory against an orc fleet that had plagued the trade routes. The Emperor's fury carried spoils, captured enemy vessels, data on the foe's movements, and a cargo of recruits from the liberated worlds. But space was no forgiving place. The Imperium spanned 1,000,000 worlds, but between them lay the darkness, filled with enemies that never slumbered. "Hold course, Voss," he ordered. "We must reach Orask Prime before the month's end. The colony needs our cargoes, and the Admiral brooks no excuses." The bridge hummed with activity. Servitors, half-human hybrids of flesh and machine, clicked with mechanical limbs as they fed data into the systems. Officer staff, young lieutenants in freshly pressed uniforms, and older warrant officers with tattoos from forgotten wars, shouted orders through the Vox systems. "Shields at nominal levels, Captain," called an engineer from his console. "Weapon loading complete. Macro cannons ready to fire." Vaughn allowed himself a thin smile. His crew was loyal, tempered in the fires of previous battles. Among them was Sergeant Myra Kale, a tough woman from Katachan with arms like ropes and an eye replaced by a bionic implant after an Eldar raid. She led the storm troopers, the armed guards who patrolled the corridors and stamped out mutinies or Xenos incursions. Then there was Priest Torvald, a gaunt figure in a robe decorated with skulls, who led morning prayers each day in the great halls where thousands of voidfarers knelt before the altar to the Emperor. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Rumors spread like fire in dry grass, whispers of a chaos uprising in the neighboring subsector, of ships vanishing into the warp's embrace, their crews twisted into puppets for the dark gods. Vaughn dismissed them as soldierly superstitions, but deep down he felt a chill in his gut. He had seen what chaos could do during the Battle of Corvus Gate, where a sister ship had exploded from within, its crew mutated into hulking monstrosities that screamed prayers to unknown demons. Suddenly, the ship shuddered violently. Alarm sirens wailed like a dying dragon, and red lights flashed across the bridge. "What in the Emperor's name?" growled Vaughn, grabbing a handhold as the deck tilted. "Report," shouted Lieutenant Harrow, his face pale beneath the short helm. From the engineering console came the answer, a voice thick with panic. "Captain, we've got an anomaly, the warp rift." It opened. "Something hit us, a gravitational wave or worse," Voss hissed, her body taut as a bowstring. "It's no rift, Captain, it's a gate. Something's coming through." On the main screen, chaos erupted in colors. The void tore open like fabric, and a vortex of purple and black, the warp's flesh, vomited forth a fleet of shadows. 14 enemy ships emerged like ghosts from the fog. A massive despoiler-class battleship, its hull covered in thorny growths that pulsed with unnatural life, flanked by 3 devastation-class cruisers whose guns glowed with hellfire. Smaller escorts, twisted raiders with sails of demon hide, swarmed around like hungry insects. It was a chaos fleet, led by the Black Legion, the fallen sons of Horus Lupercal, seeking once more to shatter the Imperium's spine. "Enemy contact, range 10,000 kilometers," cried the sensor operator. "They're firing," the world exploded in fire. Macro-cannon broadsides from the lead Chaos cruiser, Bloody Vengeance, tore through space, each projectile a kilometer-long cylinder charged with plasma that could shatter a moon to pieces. The Emperor's fury veered aside, its void shields flickering to life like a barrier of invisible light, but the first salvo struck home regardless. One shot ripped through the outer hull on the port side, penetrating the shields and detonating in an ammunition bay. The shockwave hurled the crew like ragdolls, and screams echoed through the corridors as dozens of Voidmen were crushed against the walls. "Damage on decks 7 and 8, reported the chief engine seer, a tech priest named Korvath, his voice a mechanical buzz. "Fires in cargo hold 3, we are losing pressure." Vaughn seized the Vox microphone, his voice steady as steel amid the chaos. "All stations, battle stations, gunners, focus on the flagship. Voss, get us out of here, avoid the warp, use sublight if you must. Myra, your troops to the damage sites, no enemy comes aboard." The bridge filled with voices and pips, orders flying like arrows. The ship roared forward, its own macro cannons howling in reply. Broadside after broadside of projectiles, each a storm of steel and fire, hurtled toward the foe. One struck a smaller escort, Demon's Claw, tearing it in two in a blinding explosion that lit the void like a newborn star. Debris rained like fire, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The great Chaos battleship, Eternal Despair, fired its lance batteries, beams of pure white energy slicing through space like knives through butter. One struck the Emperor's Fury square in the stern, and the plasma reactor shook violently. "Reactor overheating," screamed Korvath. "We must shut down main drive or it melts." Vaughn cursed inwardly. They couldn't flee, not with the enemy so close. The cruiser was built for war, layered in armor and weapons that could withstand an army, but against a full fleet, it was like facing a storm with a shield. He recalled his training at the Naval Academy. "In the Emperor's service, we die standing, not on our knees." But death was one thing, defeat another. If they lost the ship, the entire convoy, 13 transports carrying civilians and soldiers, would be doomed. Down in the lower decks, amid steaming pipes and sparking panels, Myra Kale and her storm troopers battled the chaos. The corridors were a labyrinth of steel and blood, lit by emergency lights flickering like hellfire. "Forward for the Emperor," she shouted, her lasgun unleashing belts of fire against the burning sections. Servitors staggered forth, their eyes vacant, dragging hoses to quench the flames, while wounded Voidmen screamed for morphine and absolution. An explosion tore open a bulkhead, and the vacuum rushed in cold and merciless, sucking 2 men out into the void. Their screams cut off abruptly as they froze solid in space. Myra sealed the hatch with a servitor's aid, her heart pounding. "Hold the line, priest, give them faith." Torvald stood there, his staff raised, reciting the litany. "The Emperor protects the faithful, his light scatters the darkness." His words echoed, and for a moment it felt as if the ship breathed deeper, as if the Emperor's will flowed through the metal. Up on the bridge, Vaughn watched the battle on the screens. The enemy ships closing in, their hulls adorned with runes that writhed like living serpents. Eternal Despair was a monster, a relic from the heresy's time, its guns mutated into organic tubes that spat fire with a hunger no machine could match. A devastation cruiser, Soulflayer, flanked it and launched torpedoes, vast projectiles laden with demons that would breach and burst the ship from within. "Torpedoes away," warned Harrow. "Time to impact." 2 minutes, Vaughn turned to Voss. "Can we maneuver clear?" She shook her head, sweat beading on her brow. "Not in time. They're too fast, Captain, and I sense it. There's something aboard that great ship. a lord of chaos, a sorcerer. His will tugs at the warp like a hook. The battle intensified. The Emperor's fury replied with all she had, nova cannons unleashing beams of particles that could rend atoms asunder, and squadrons of fury interceptors swarming from hangar bays like bees from a hive. One squadron struck Soulflayer, and bombs detonated against its hull, ripping wounds that bled plasma. But the enemy did not yield. A torpedo struck near the prow, and the ship shook as if hammered by a god. Structural alarms wailed. Hull breach, Deck 12 collapsing. In the engine room, deep within the ship, Korvath led a desperate struggle against the machines. Tech priests and their acolytes knelt around the reactor, oil and blood mingling on the deck. Omnissiah, grant us strength, they chanted as they repaired circuits with sacred tools. A young acolyte, barely 16 standard years, died when a pressure wave crushed his chest, but the others pressed on, their incantations a monotonous murmur that kept the machine spirits in check. Vaughn stared out into space, where explosions bloomed like fireflowers. They had damaged 2 enemy ships, but eternal despair closed now, ready for the deathly kiss of boarding. Prepare for close quarters, he ordered. No enemy survivors. For the Imperium, the ship shuddered again, harder this time. A lance struck the bridge directly, and the glass cracked in a spiderweb. Shards rained down, and an officer screamed as his arm was torn away. Voss fell, blood trickling from a gash in her side, but she rose, her eyes glowing within a fire. "They're here," she whispered. "The gods whisper their names." In that moment, Vaughn felt the true horror. Not the weapons, not the ships, but the knowledge that chaos did not merely want to kill them. It wanted to claim them, to twist loyal souls into slaves for the dark powers. He gripped his sword, a relic from his father, and braced for the worst. The battle raged on, hours that felt like days. The Emperor's fury danced a tango of death through space, evading broadsides while her own guns roared. A devastation cruiser exploded in a chain reaction when a Nova cannon struck its reactor, and the debris crushed an escort. But the cost was high. Shields collapsed, the hull leaked air, and the crew dwindled with every minute. At last, after an eternity of fire and screams, the decisive blow came. Eternal despair closed for a ramming, its prow like a spike of hate. Vaughn ordered a desperate maneuver, all propulsion to the prow. Ram them back. The 2 giants collided in a symphony of metal and fire. Hulls were rent asunder, corridors opened to vacuum, and boarding parties from both sides poured forth. Chaos Space Marines, superwarriors in armor adorned with skulls and chains, advanced with bolters spitting hellshot. They were like demons forged in steel, each step echoing the fallen legacy of Horus. Myra met them in the Grand Hall, her troops a wall of lasgun fire. "For the Emperor," she roared, and a volley felled 3 foes, but chaos was relentless. A shoulder cannon shredded her shield, and a chain axe swung for her throat. She ducked, fired back, and watched the enemy's helm crack like an egg. Priest Torvald stood amid the fray, his evangelist censer swinging as he wielded a Crozius. Heretics. Die in filth, a Chaos Marine, a twisted figure with horns sprouting from his brow, laughed and fired his pistol. The bolt struck Torvald's chest, but he pressed on, driving the mace into the foe's throat. Blood black as tar sprayed forth, and the demon within screamed. On the bridge, Vaughn fought hand to hand, his sword dancing against an intruding officer, a mutant with 3 arms and eyes that glowed. "Your ship is ours," the creature hissed. Vaughn parried, thrust, and felt the blade pierce flesh. "Never," he spat. "The Emperor protects," but the numbers did not lie. The crew died by the hundreds, corridors filled with corpses, and the ship bled from 1,000 wounds. Eternal despair withdrew, damaged but undefeated, and the remaining Chaos fleet retreated into the warp, leaving the Emperor's fury adrift in space like a wounded whale. The damage was catastrophic. The main reactor leaked plasma, the frame was cracked in 3 places, and half the weapon systems were offline. Vaughn, breathless and bloodied, stared out into the void. "Status?" he asked. Korvath replied, "Captain, we're drifting. But without repairs, we have days, perhaps hours." Voss, bound by servitors, nodded weakly. "The warp is closed to us now. We must repair here in real space, or we all die." Vaughn felt the weight of command. Thousands of lives, all his responsibility. Then we repair, and we pray to the Emperor for strength. This is not the end. But in the darkness, beyond sight, he knew chaos did not relent. It lurked, waiting for weakness. And in the ship's wounds, in the dark corners where blood dried, the first seeds of corruption already whispered. Chapter 2. In the cold, flickering light from the emergency lighting, the crew of the Emperor's Fury struggled to keep the ship alive. The hull, scarred and perforated by the Chaos Fleet's assault, leaked oxygen in thin streams that froze into crystals in the vacuum of space. Corridors, once filled with disciplined steps and prayers, were now chaotic labyrinths of wreckage, blood, and sparks from broken circuits. The scent of burned metal mingled with incense from the tech priests who chanted psalms to the Omnissiah, their voices a desperate attempt to soothe the machine spirits that screamed in agony. Captain Elias Vaughn stood in the engine room, surrounded by tech priests and engineers battling the reactor's spillover. The massive plasma reactor, the ship's heart, pulsed irregularly, its glow dimmer than usual. Red warning runes flashed on the control panels, and a low, vibrating tone filled the air as if the ship itself sighed under its burden. Engineer Korvath, his mechanical arms humming with activity, led the repairs. His face, half flesh and half machine, was taut with concentration as he rerouted circuits and recited binary litanies. "Captain," Korvath said, his voice a metallic echo, "the reactor is stabilized, but only just. We've lost 3 secondary cooling systems, and the plasma flow is unstable. If we attempt sublight drive now, we risk a meltdown." Vaughn nodded, his face as hard as adamantium. "How long until we can move?" 12 standard hours if we can restore the cooling systems, but we need materials, adamantium plates, superconductors, and at least 5,000 meters of new cabling. Our stores are insufficient, Vaughn swore quietly. The ship's stores were depleted after the last campaign, and they were in a dead zone between star systems, far from the Imperium's outposts. Sending a distress signal was risky. It could attract more enemies, perhaps even the Chaos Fleet that had retreated into the warp. But doing nothing was not an option. Without propulsion, they were easy prey, a wounded beast waiting for predators to circle. "Mobilize all available servitors," Vaughn ordered. "Strip the damaged sections for parts. If we have to cannibalize decks 12 and 13, do it. I want propulsion in 8 hours." Korvath hesitated, his bionic eye whirring. "Captain, that is sacrilege. The machine spirits in those sections. The machine spirits can pray to the Emperor for forgiveness, just like the rest of us," Vaughn interrupted. "Do it." On the lower decks, Sergeant Myra Cale led a squad of stormtroopers through the ravaged corridors. Her lasgun hung over her shoulder, but her hands were busy pulling a wounded sailor from the wreckage. The man, a young gunner named Joran, had an arm crushed by a falling beam. His face was pale, his breath short, but he still murmured prayers to the Emperor. "Hold on, lad," Myra said, her voice gruff but not without warmth. "We've seen worse than this on Katachan." Behind her, her troops patrolled, weapons ready. Rumors of chaos infiltration had begun to spread. Crewmen whispered of shadows moving in the darkness, of strange noises from the sealed sections, like claws against metal or voices chanting in languages no one understood. Myra dismissed it as nerves, but her bionic eye scanned every corner, searching for signs of corruption. In one of the collapsed corridors, where an explosion had torn open a wall to space, a group of servitors worked to weld adamantium plates over the breach. Their mechanical movements were sluggish, their programming damaged by electromagnetic pulses from the battle. One of them, a unit with a human torso and spider-like legs, suddenly froze and began muttering a stream of binary code. Myra raised her weapon. "Korvath," she shouted over the vox, "your damned toy is glitching again." The tech priest responded quickly, "It is no glitch. The machine spirit is distressed. Something is interfering with its sacred circuits. I am sending an acolyte." But before the acolyte could arrive, it happened. An inhuman, shrill scream echoed through the corridor. From a broken ventilation duct, a wave of red, pulsating tentacles erupted, each tip adorned with barbs dripping venom. They lashed out at the servitor, tearing it to pieces in a grotesque explosion of metal and flesh. Myra bellowed an order, "Fire!" Lasguns opened fire, and the corridor lit up with red beams. The tentacles recoiled, but not before dragging one of her soldiers, a woman named Selene, into the darkness. Her scream cut through the vox before it fell silent. "Heretic shit," Myra swore, hurling a frag grenade into the vent. The explosion boomed, and the tentacles vanished in a stench of burned flesh. "Report to the bridge," she ordered. "We've got Xenos or worse aboard. Seal all vents on deck 10. On the bridge, Vaughn received the news with a grimace. "Chaos never leaves a job half done," he muttered. He turned to Navigator Lyra Voss, who lay in a medical cot hooked to life support systems. Her wounds from the battle were bandaged, but her face was still pale, her eyes glowing with warp energy. "Voss, can you sense them?" "Are they demons?" She nodded weakly. "It is not just demons, Captain. It is a presence, a will. Something was planted aboard during the attack. I feel it in the warp, like a stain on reality." Vaughn seized the Vox microphone. "Priest Torvald to the bridge. Now." Torvald arrived within minutes, his robes stained with blood and ash from the battle. His eyes burned with fanaticism, and he clutched a relic in his hand, a fragment of a martyr captain's armor, blessed on terror. "Captain, what is this?" he asked, his voice trembling with both rage and zeal. "We have an infiltration," Vaughn said. "Something came aboard with the chaos. I need you and your acolytes to purge the ship." "No hesitation, no mercy," Torvald nodded, his lips forming a silent prayer. "The Emperor will guide us. We shall burn this heresy out with fire and faith." As Torvald gathered his priests for a purge, the repairs continued at a feverish pace. In the engine room, Korvath led a group of acolytes scavenging parts from the damaged sections. They worked in shifts, their hands bloody and their voices hoarse from chanting the Omnissiah's psalms. But progress was slow. For every system they fixed, new faults arose. Cables burned out, circuits shorted, and servitors began behaving erratically, as if something was disrupting their programming. Myra and her troops patrolled the lower decks, where the shadows seemed thicker and the air heavier. In one of the abandoned corridors, they found traces of corruption, walls covered in a slimy black substance that pulsed like a living organ. Runes etched into the metal glowed faintly and whispered words in a language that chilled the blood. "This isn't Xenos," Myra said, spitting on the floor. "It's chaos. We need flamers." Her vox crackled to life with a panicked voice. "Sergeant, deck 14, something broke through the barricades. It's men, but not men." Myra ran, her troops at her heels. When they reached deck 14, they faced a nightmare. A dozen crewmen, or what had once been crewmen, stood there. Their eyes were black voids, their bodies covered in mutated growths, tentacles, claws, and extra mouths muttering curses. One of them, a former engineer, wielded a severed arm as a weapon and laughed with a voice that was not his own. "Fire!" Myra screamed, and the lasguns lit up the darkness. The mutated crewmen moved with unnatural speed, their bodies jerking like puppets. One lunged at Myra, but she dodged and plunged her combat knife into a gap in its armor. It roared, but a second mutant seized her and slammed her against the wall. Pain exploded in her back, but she rose, blood trickling from her mouth. "Not today," she spat, hurling a grenade. The explosion rocked the corridor, and 3 foes fell, their armor cracked. But more came, like a tide of hate. Torvald stood beside her now, his Crozius Arcanum glowing with holy energy. "The Emperor sees us," he roared, cleaving a mutant in 2, his weapon slicing through ceramite as if it were paper. On the bridge, Vaughn wrestled with his own demons. A second wave of boarding torpedoes had struck near the command center, and now the sounds of chainswords and bolter fire echoed through the walls. He drew his sword and ordered his officers to form a defensive line. "Hold the bridge," he shouted. "If we lose it, the ship is dead." The battle became a chaotic whirl of blood and steel. Chaos Space Marines, their eyes glowing with warp energy, carved through the crew like wolves through sheep. But the Imperium soldiers did not yield. A young officer, Lieutenant Sarin, charged a foe with a power fist and crushed its helm before falling himself, struck by a bolter round. In the engine room, Korvath fought to keep the reactor running. A Chaos Space Marine had broken in, its presence a blight on the machine spirits. Korvath met it with a mechanical claw, his body augmented by the Omnissiah's blessings. "You shall not defile this sacred chamber," he bellowed, lunging at the enemy. But the Marine was faster, and a sword sheared through Korvath's bionic arm, sparks flying. He fell, but not before activating an emergency circuit that sent an electric pulse through the room, dropping the foe in spasms. Out in space, the small Chaos ships closed in, their guns firing salvos at the Emperor's fury. The shields were down, and each hit tore new wounds in the hull. But the crew fought on, driven by faith and desperation. Myra, bloodied and breathless, led a counterattack that drove the enemy back from Deck 9. Torvald purged the corridors with fire and prayers, and even Voss, weak and wounded, rose from her cot to hurl a psychic pulse at a Chaos sorcerer attempting to infiltrate the bridge. As the battle reached its climax, something unexpected happened. The sensors picked up a new signal, not Chaos, but Imperium. A small flotilla, led by a sword-class frigate, emerged from the void. Their guns opened fire, and the Chaos escorts exploded in pieces. A message came over the Vox: "This is the Flames Guard. Hold fast, Emperor's fury, reinforcements inbound." Vaughn allowed himself a breath of relief, but he knew the fight was not over. Chaos Space Marines still battled aboard, and the ship was far from saved. But hope, that damned hope, began to take root in his chest. "Keep fighting," he roared, "for the Emperor, for the Imperium." And in the darkness, amid blood and fire, the Emperor's fury continued to breathe, its crew a shield against the chaos. Chapter 3, the space around the Emperor's fury, was a battlefield of glowing wreckage and flashing explosions. The proud ship, battered and bleeding plasma from countless wounds, struggled to stay afloat in the cold embrace of the void. Inside its corridors raged another battle, a brutal close-quarters fight between the Imperium's loyal soldiers and Chaos Space Marines, who had bored into it like maggots in a dying body. The crew, driven by faith and desperation, held the line, but the price was high. Corridors were covered in blood, both human and inhuman, and the air vibrated with screams, prayers, and the roar of chainswords. Captain Elias Vaughn stood on the bridge, his sword dripping with black ichor from a Chaos Space Marine he had just felled. His uniform was torn, a deep gash ran across his left arm, but his eyes burned with determination. Around him, his officers fought intruders who had broken through the outer defense lines. Lieutenant Harrow, his face covered in ash, fired his las pistol with precision, each shot a prayer to the Emperor. But the enemy was relentless. Chaos Space Marines, their armor adorned with skulls and pulsing runes, moved with unnatural strength, as if the warp's darkness itself fueled them. "Status on reinforcements," Vaughn shouted over the Vox, his voice cutting through the chaos. Harrow glanced at the sensor console, which flickered with interference. "Vigil of Flame is 3,000 kilometers away, Captain. They're engaging the Chaos escorts, but they can't reach us yet. We have more boarding torpedoes incoming." Vaughn swore quietly. Vigil of Flame, a sword-class frigate, was a welcome ally, but its small flotilla couldn't match the raw power of the Chaos fleet still lurking in the shadows. He turned to Navigator Lyra Voss, who lay in her medical bed, her body weak but her mind still linked to the warp's currents. "Voss, can you give me something? What are they planning?" Voss's face was pale, her breath short. They're not here to destroy us, Captain," she whispered. "They want the ship. There's something aboard, something they're seeking, a relic perhaps or a soul. I can't see clearly, the warp is too murky." Vaughn clenched his fist. A relic. The ship carried many holy artifacts, icons, martyr bones, even a sealed casket in the deepest chapel, blessed by a cardinal on Terra. But what could Chaos want with them? Or was it something else, something hidden in the ship's dark corners? On the lower decks, Sergeant Myra Cale led her stormtroopers in a desperate fight to hold the corridors. Her unit had been halved, their bodies scattered among debris and mutated corpses. Chaos Space Marines had broken through at several points, and now reports came in of demons, beings of pure warp energy materializing from the shadows, their forms fluid and horrifying. Myra had seen much in her years on Katachan, but this was something else. One of her soldiers, Tark, had fallen when a demon with tentacles and glowing eyes tore out his heart. She had burned the creature with a flamer, but its screams still echoed in her mind. "Forward," she screamed, her voice raw from hours of combat. Her bionic eyes scanned the corridor, and she spotted the heat signature of something large approaching. "Flamers ready, priest, we need you." Priest Torvald, his hood torn and his body covered in wounds, stood beside her. He held his crozius high, its blade glowing with holy energy. "The Emperor is our shield," he shouted, hurling a vial of holy water at the enemy. The water hissed against a Chaos Space Marine's armor, and the warrior roared as the runes on his plate began to melt. Torvald's acolytes, armed with chain weapons and relic pistols, formed a line behind him, their prayers a roar that drowned out the chaos of battle. But the enemy did not yield. A chaos sorcerer, a tall figure in a hood of black fabric that moved as if alive, emerged from the shadows. His staff glowed with purple fire, and as he raised it, the floor exploded in a wave of warp energy. Two of Myra's soldiers turned to ash in an instant, their screams echoing into eternity. Myra dove aside, her knife already in hand, and lobbed a grenade at the sorcerer. The explosion rocked the corridor, but he stood unscathed, his laughter like knives against her soul. "You cannot stop us, mortal," he hissed. "This ship already belongs to the Chaos Gods." Torvald lunged forward, his crozius swinging in an arc. "Blasphemy!" he screamed, striking at the sorcerer. The blade hit, but instead of blood, a swarm of black insects burst from the wound, their wings buzzing like a choir of demons. The sorcerer raised his staff, and a wave of energy hurled Torvald against the wall. The priest fell, but his hand clutched the relic around his neck, and he began reciting an exorcism. "In the Emperor's name, I banish you." The air vibrated, and the sorcerer recoiled, his form flickering as if battling an invisible force. Myra saw her chance. She charged forward, her knife gleaming, and drove it straight through the sorcerer's chest. He screamed, a sound wave that burst her eardrums, but then he collapsed into a pile of ash and bone. "For the Emperor," she whispered, breathless, helping Torvald to his feet. In the engine room, Engineer Korvath fought to keep the reactor alive. His bionic arm was gone, replaced by a makeshift prosthetic that sparked with every movement. Around him, his acolytes worked frantically, their hands slick with holy oil as they repaired broken circuits and chanted hymns to the Omnissiah. But corruption spread even here. The room's walls had begun to pulse, as if the ship's metal had been infected by the warp's poison. One of the acolytes, a young boy named Irek, suddenly screamed and clutched his head. His eyes turned black, and his voice became a cacophony of voices. "They're coming, they see us all." Korvath acted swiftly. He seized a holy circuit breaker and drove it through the boy's chest, ending his suffering before the corruption could spread. "Omnissiah, forgive us," he muttered, returning to the reactor. But the damage was done. Several servitors had frozen, their programming ruined by warp interference, and repairs proceeded slower than ever. On the bridge, Vaughn received a new report. Vigil of Flame had destroyed 2 Chaos escorts, but a third had managed to launch more boarding torpedoes. Explosions now echoed from decks 6 and 7, where the enemy was breaking through. Vaughn gripped his sword and rallied his officers. "We hold the bridge to the last man," he said. "No heretic sets foot here." But before he could lead the defense, something unexpected happened. The sensors flared to life with a new signal, not Chaos, not Imperium, but something else. Harrow stared at the screen, his face paling. "Captain, it's Eldar. One ship, maybe 2. They're moving fast, cloaking technology. They're already within 1,000 kilometers." Vaughn felt a new chill in his gut. Eldar, Xenos, cunning and deadly, whose motives were impossible to predict. Were they here to help or to exploit the chaos? "Voss, what do you see?" he asked. The navigator, now sitting upright despite the pain, focused her senses. "There, Eldari from a craft world. I sense their minds cold, focused. They're hunting something, Captain." "The same thing Chaos wants." "Wonderful," Vaughn muttered. "Now we have 2 enemies to deal with." But before he could issue orders, a new wave of boarding torpedoes exploded through the hull, this time near the bridge. The door blew open, and Chaos Space Marines stormed in, their bolters spewing death. Vaughn raised his sword and threw himself into the fray, his blade meeting an enemy's chainsword in a shower of sparks. "For the Emperor," he roared, and his officers followed, their las pistols and sabers a feeble defense against the armored giants. Meanwhile, on the lower decks, Myra and Torvald faced a new foe. From the shadows emerged Eldar warriors, their armor gleaming like black glass, their weapons swift and deadly. They moved like ghosts, their shuriken pistols firing discs of monomolecular steel that sliced through both Chaos Space Marines and Imperial soldiers without distinction. Their leader, a figure in a rune-etched cloak, raised a hand and spoke in a melodic tongue. Myra didn't understand the words, but the message was clear. They were not here as friends. "What in the Emperor's name do you want?" she screamed, her lasgun aimed at the Xenos. The Eldar leader turned to her, her eyes glowing like stars. "What is hidden aboard?" she said in halting Gothic. "Give it to us or die." Myra spat on the floor. "Come and take it then." The battle escalated into a three-way conflict. Chaos Space Marines fought against both the Imperium and the Eldar, while the Eldar attacked anything that moved. Myra and her troopers hung back, their lasguns and grenades focused on Chaos, but the Eldar's speed made them hard to ignore. Torvald charged an Eldar warrior, his crozier striking its armor, but the Xenos vanished in a mist of shadows, only to reappear behind him and slash with a sword that sang as it cut through the air. On the bridge, Vaughn held the line, but the situation grew ever more desperate. Chaos Space Marines had breached the inner defenses, and now the sounds of Eldar weapons, shuriken pistols and something heavier, perhaps a las cannon, echoed through. Harrow fell, a shuriken through his throat, and Vaughn dragged him behind a console before charging a Chaos Space Marine himself. His sword struck true, but the enemy laughed, its armor impervious to all but the heaviest weapons. In the engine room, Korvath achieved a breakthrough. By cannibalizing parts from a secondary weapon system, he restored one of the cooling arrays, and the reactor began to stabilize. "Captain," he reported over the Vox. "We have partial thrust, not enough for subliminal, but we can maneuver." "That'll do," Vaughn replied, his voice strained as he parried a chainsword. "Give me everything you've got, Korvath." Out in space, Vigil of Flame engaged the remaining Chaos escorts, but the Eldar ships, slender, deadly vessels that glided through the void like knives, attacked both sides. Their weapons, unknown and exotic, sliced through Chaos hulls and Imperial hulls with equal ease. Vaughn realized they were trapped. Chaos wanted the ship, the Eldar wanted something aboard, and his crew was caught in the middle. "Voss," he shouted, "we need to know what they're after. Can you trace it?" Voss nodded, her mind plunging deeper into the warp. The pain was excruciating, but she focused, her third eye glowing beneath the silver wires. "It's in the chapel," she whispered. "The sealed casket, it bears a secret, something ancient. Chaos and Eldar sense it. It's a key to something terrible." Vaughn realized what was at stake. The casket, blessed on terror, had always been an enigma. He had never opened it, out of respect for its sanctity, but now he understood it was more than a relic. It was a danger. "Myra," he called over the Vox, "take your troopers to the chapel. Protect the casket at all costs." Myra, in the midst of battle, nodded. "On our way, Captain." She gathered her surviving soldiers, now just a dozen, and ran for the chapel, Torvald at her side. Eldar and Chaos Space Marines pursued, their fight a deadly dance in the corridors. When they reached the chapel, a vast hall adorned with icons and skulls, they found the casket, a sarcophagus of black stone covered in seals and chains. It pulsed faintly, as if something inside lived. The Eldar leader appeared, her sword glowing. "Give us the casket, human," she said. "You do not understand what you hold." Myra raised her weapon. "Try to take it, Xenos." The battle that followed was a storm of fire and steel. Chaos Space Marines crashed through the doors, their bolters roaring, while the Eldar attacked from the shadows. Myra and Torvald fought side by side, their weapons a bulwark against the foe. But the casket began to glow brighter, and a voice, inhuman, ancient, began to whisper from within. Myra felt a chill spread through her soul, but she clung to her faith. "The Emperor protects," she screamed, hurling herself at the Eldar leader. On the bridge, Vaughn made a final desperate play. He ordered Korvath to overload the reactor for a brief subliminal maneuver, enough to pull them out of the Eldar's range. The ship shuddered as the engines roared to life, and for a moment it seemed they might escape. But the sensors flashed again. A new Chaos ship, larger than the others, emerged from the warp. It was Eternal Despair, returned to finish what it had started. "Captain," an officer screamed, "they're charging their lance batteries." Vaughn stared out into the void, where the enemy ship glowed like a demonic sun. He gripped his sword tighter. "Then we meet them," he said, "for the Imperium." Chapter 4, the space around the Emperor's Fury, was a burning graveyard, filled with wreckage glowing in the cold void. The proud ship, once a symbol of the Imperium's power, was now a battered hulk, its hull pierced by Chaos and Eldar weapons. Inside, a battle raged that threatened to tear apart both ship and souls. The crew, bloodied and exhausted, fought against two enemies, Chaos Space Marines, their hatred fueled by the dark gods of the warp, and Eldar, whose Xeno's cunning made them as deadly as they were unpredictable. At the heart of the ship, in the sacred chapel, stood a casket of black stone, a secret that both Chaos and Eldar were willing to die to control. Captain Elias Vaughn stood on the bridge, his sword still wet with the enemy's blood. His body ached, his left arm useless after a strike from a Chaos Space Marine's chain sword, but his will was unbroken. Through the cracked viewport, he saw the Eternal Despair, the Chaos battleship that had returned to finish its work. Its lance batteries glowed like demonic eyes, and Vaughn knew the next salvo could be the last. The sensor consoles blinked with warnings. Eldar ships circled like birds of prey, their cloaking technology making them hard to track, while the Ember's Guard, the Imperium's frigate, struggled to keep the Chaos escorts at bay. "Report," Vaughn shouted, his voice hoarse from the tumult of battle. Lieutenant Sarin, who had miraculously survived a shuriken hit thanks to an acolyte's quick intervention, replied from the console. "Captain, shields are down to 10%. We have propulsion, but barely. Ember's Guard reports heavy losses, but they're holding the line. The Eldar ships, they're attacking both sides." Vaughn turned to Navigator Lyra Voss, who now stood upright despite her wounds, her silver-threaded eyes glowing with warp energy. "Voss, what do the Eldar want? Why are they here?" Her voice was weak but steady. "The casket, Captain, it carries something ancient, an artifact, perhaps an imprisoned entity. Chaos wants to use it to open a portal to the warp. The Eldar want to destroy it or take it. I can't see which." Vaughn nodded, his thoughts racing. The casket in the chapel had always been a holy relic, but its true nature was unknown. Now he understood it was a bomb waiting to detonate. We must protect it or destroy it ourselves before the enemy reaches it. In the chapel, Sergeant Myra and Priest Torvald fought against a storm of enemies. Chaos Space Marines, their armor covered in pulsing runes, had breached the outer barricades, while Eldar warriors, swift as shadows, attacked from the flanks. The casket stood in the center of the chamber, its black surface glowing with an unnatural energy that made the air vibrate. Myra, bloodied and breathless, held her lasgun ready, her bionic eye scanning for movement. Torvald stood at her side, his crozius glowing with holy power, his voice raised in an exorcism that made the runes on the casket flicker. "We can't hold them much longer," Myra shouted over the vox. "Captain, we need reinforcements." Vaughn's response came quickly. "Hold the line, Myra. We're sending what we have. Protect the casket at all costs." But reinforcements were few. The crew was decimated, and the few stormtroopers left were already fighting in other parts of the ship. Myra swore and lobbed a grenade at a group of Chaos Space Marines charging forward. The explosion tore up the deck, but the enemy pressed on, their bolters spitting death. An Eldar warrior, a banshee with a sword that sang, lunged at Myra, but she ducked and drove her combat knife through the Xeno's warrior's side. The Eldar fell, but her scream echoed like a curse. Torvald raised his relic, a fragment of a martyr captain's armor, and recited, "In the Emperor's name, I banish you." A wave of light pulsed from him, and several Chaos Space Marines recoiled, their armor hissing as if burning. But the casket began to glow brighter, and a voice, deep, inhuman, and filled with ancient hate, echoed through the chamber. "Free me, and I shall grant you eternity." Myra felt a chill grip her heart. "Torvald, what in the Emperor's name is in there?" The priest shook his head, his face pale. "A demon, perhaps, or worse. We must destroy it before they reach it." In the engine room, Engineer Korvath fought to keep the reactor alive. His acolytes, now only a handful, worked frantically, their hands covered in oil and blood. The walls still pulsed with the warp's corruption, and several servitors had collapsed, their circuits burned by unseen forces. Korvath, his makeshift augmetic sparking, rerouted a final circuit and felt the reactor stabilize. "Captain," he reported via Vox, "we have 20% propulsion. Not enough for the warp, but we can move." "Do it," Vaughn replied. "Get us away from eternal despair." "Buy us time." The ship shuddered as the engines roared to life, and the Emperor's fury began to move slowly, its hull groaning under the strain. But eternal despair was not far behind. Its lance batteries fired, and a beam of white energy struck the stern, tearing open a new gash in the hull. Alarm sirens wailed, and pressure losses were reported from decks 15 and 16. On the bridge, Vaughn led the defense against a new wave of Chaos Space Marines. His sword danced, but he was weary, his movements slower than before. A Marine, a giant with horns growing from his helm, lunged at him, and Vaughn parried just in time. An officer at his side, a young woman named Lyra, fell as a bolter round struck her chest, her body collapsing in a heap of blood and uniform. "Voss," Vaughn shouted, "can you do something?" "Anything," the navigator nodded, her body trembling with effort. She raised her hands, and a psychic pulse exploded from her, hurling Chaos Space Marines against the walls. But the price was high, blood trickled from her eyes, and she collapsed back into her throne, unconscious. Out in space, the battle intensified. Ember's guard had managed to destroy one Chaos escort, but the Eldar ships continued to attack, their weapons slicing through both Chaos and Imperium with surgical precision. Vaughn realized they were in an impossible situation. Chaos wanted to take the ship, the Eldar wanted the casket, and his crew was caught in the crossfire. In the chapel, the battle reached its climax. Myra and Torvald fought back to back, their weapons a whirlwind of fire and steel. Chaos Space Marines had reached the casket, and their leader, a massive figure in armor covered with blinking eyes, raised a chain sword against the seals. "It is ours," he roared, his voice amplified by the warp's power. But before he could strike, the Eldar leader appeared, her sword a blur of death. She cut through two Chaos Space Marines as if they were paper and lunged toward the casket. Myra screamed and fired her lasgun, but the Eldar's armor absorbed the hits. Torvald hurled his relic at her, and an explosion of light forced her back. "The casket," Myra shouted. "We have to destroy it," Torvald nodded, his face resolute. He grabbed a holy grenade from his belt, a relic blessed on Mars, and lobbed it at the casket. The explosion shook the chamber, and the seals on the casket cracked, but instead of being destroyed, it opened. A wave of black energy exploded outward, and a form began to take shape. A demon, its body a swirl of shadows and claws, its eyes glowing like burning stars. "You have freed me," it roared, and the air filled with laughter that cut through the soul. Myra and Torvald threw themselves back, their weapons useless against the creature. The Chaos Space Marines knelt before it, their voices chanting praises to the Chaos gods, while the Eldar leader screamed in frustration and lunged at the demon. Her sword struck true, but the demon laughed and flung her against the wall with a gesture. On the bridge, Vaughn watched what was happening through a flickering screen. "Emperor, have mercy on us," he whispered. He grabbed the Vox microphone. "Korvath, overload the reactor. If we can't save the ship, we'll take the enemy with us." Korvath, in the engine room, hesitated only a moment. "Omnissiah, forgive us," he muttered, and began activating the emergency circuits. The reactor began to glow, its energy building toward critical mass. In the chapel, Myra and Torvald fought the demon, their faith their only weapon. Torvald raised his crozius and recited a final exorcism. "In the Emperor's name, I banish you." The light from his relic struck the demon, and it roared, its form flickering. Myra lunged forward, her knife glowing with holy oil, and drove it into the demon's chest. It screamed, and an explosion of warp energy hurled her back. The casket collapsed, its energy extinguished, and the demon vanished in a swirl of smoke. The Chaos Space Marines, bereft of their god, fled in panic, while the Eldar leader melted into the shadows. Her mission failed. But the price was high. The reactor reached critical mass, and Vaughn gave the final order: all hands to escape pods. Now, the crew, what remained of it, raced for the pods as the ship began to shake apart. Myra and Torvald, both wounded, reached a pod just in time. Vaughn, on the bridge, refused to abandon his ship. "The Emperor protects," he said to himself, and activated the self-destruct sequence. The Emperor's fury exploded in a blinding ball of light, taking eternal despair and the remaining chaos ships with it to oblivion. In space, the escape pods drifted, small lights in the darkness, as Ember's guard picked up survivors. Myra, Torvald, and a handful of others survived, their bodies and souls scarred but unbroken. The Eldar ships vanished into the void, their purpose unknown, while the Chaos Fleet was gone, annihilated by the Imperium's sacrifice. As Myra gazed out through the pod's window at the wreckage of the Emperor's fury, she whispered a prayer. For the Emperor, and in the darkness, among the stars, she felt that he was listening. Epilogue: when the dust had settled and the explosions fallen silent, the Emperor's fury lay battered, but not defeated. Its hull drifted quietly against the void, with bleeding wounds and corridors filled with the ghosts of silence. The survivors rose, bloodied and weary, but with a determination greater than any injury or loss. Captain Vaughn stood on the bridge, his gaze fixed on the distant stars that twinkled like small, cold beacons. Space had tested their faith and their strength, but they had held. The casket in the chapel was secured, its secrets still hidden, but the danger would always lurk, always threaten, always whisper in the shadows of the warp.